"Sir, can I have your leftovers?" And then John Neely Kennedy saw something that made him call for help. The silver crescent glowed under the soft shimmer of crystal chandeliers, its marble floors reflecting the warm flicker of candlelight as the elite of the city gathered to indulge in meals that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The air was thick with the scent of truffle oil-aged wine and the quiet arrogance of wealth. John Neely Kennedy, a 50-year-old U.S. senator whose name was synonymous with power and influence, sat at a corner table, his tailored suit as sharp as his reputation. The faint clink of glasses and murmured conversations of billionaires and moguls filled the room, a symphony of privilege that John had long grown accustomed to. Tonight was meant to be a celebration. A recent legislative victory had solidified his standing, and the dinner was his reward. He swirled the deep burgundy wine in his glass, watching it catch the light, but a strange unease gnawed at him. Despite his towering success, the thrill of victory felt hollow, like a note played slightly off-key. He glanced at his phone, the screen glowing with congratulatory messages, but his thoughts drifted. Years of climbing the political ladder, of shaking hands and making deals, had brought him here to the pinnacle of power. Yet something was missing, a void he couldn't name. The restaurant's opulence, with its velvet drapes and gold-trimmed plates, only amplified the feeling that he was standing at the edge of something incomplete. Then he saw her. A small movement in his peripheral vision broke his reverie, a flicker of motion that didn't belong in the polished world of the Silver Crescent. At first he thought it was just another beggar, one of the many faceless figures he'd trained himself to ignore on city streets. But when he turned his head, his breath caught. She was no more than 7 years old. Her frail frame swallowed by a tattered sweater that hung off her shoulders like a hand-me-down from a forgotten life. Her sandals were worn thin, barely clinging to her small feet, and her dark hair was tangled, framing a face pale with hunger. But it was her eyes that stopped him, cold, large, brown, and burning, with a quiet intensity that wasn't just for food. They held a mix of desperation and defiance, a look that pierced through the armor of his carefully curated life. John's jaw tightened, his fingers pausing on the stem of his wineglass. She stood just beyond the velvet rope that separated the dining area from the sidewalk, her gaze locked on the half-eaten plate of Wagyu steak on his table, the juices still glistening under the candlelight. "Sir, can I have your leftovers?" Her voice was barely audible, a whisper nearly drowned by the hum of the restaurant. But it hit John like a thunderclap, sharp and undeniable. His first instinct was to wave her off, to signal the waiter to handle it. Men like him didn't engage with street children. It wasn't their world. The Silver Crescent was a sanctuary for the powerful, a place where the messiness of poverty was kept at bay by security guards and velvet ropes. Yet something in her eyes held him captive, rooting him to his seat. It wasn't just hunger, it was something deeper, something that stirred a memory he'd long buried. Decades ago, he'd been a boy, not so different from her, scraping by in a small Louisiana town, his dreams fueled by the kindness of a teacher who saw potential in him when no one else did. The memory flickered, faint but sharp like a shard of glass, catching the light. The waiter, sensing the disruption, approached with a practiced smile, ready to usher the girl away, but John raised a hand, his voice steady but firm. "Wait!" The word surprised even him, and the waiter hesitated, glancing between the senator and the small figure at the edge of the room. John studied the girl, her hands clasped tightly together, her posture rigid as if bracing for rejection. Those eyes, they weren't pleading, not exactly. They were searching, as if testing him, daring him to see her as more than a nuisance. He pushed the plate toward her, the scrape of porcelain against the tablecloth loud in the sudden quiet of his corner. "Take it," he said, his tone colder than he intended, as if he could distance himself from the act of charity. The girl's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise crossing her face, but she didn't lunge for the food as he'd expected. Instead, she moved with a careful grace, almost reverent, as she reached for the plate. Her small hands, dirt-streaked but steady, lifted the steak and roasted vegetables, placing them gently into a crumpled plastic bag she pulled from her pocket. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, her voice soft but clear, before turning and darting out of the restaurant, her footsteps silent against the marble floor. John stared at the empty plate, the remnants of sauce streaking the white porcelain like an accusation. He should have felt good, noble, even for giving her the food. But something was wrong. The unease that had been simmering all evening boiled over, a knot tightening in his gut. Why hadn't she eaten it right there? Why the care in packing it away? Why was a child her age alone on the streets at this hour? The questions piled up, each one heavier than the last, and he found himself unable to look away from the spot where she'd disappeared. The other diners had returned to their conversations, oblivious or indifferent, but John couldn't shake the image of her eyes, the way they'd held him accountable. He stood abruptly, dropping a few crisp bills onto the table, ignoring the curious glances from nearby tables. The weight of his decision pressed against him, but he couldn't stay seated, couldn't return to his wine and his victory. He had to know. Pushing past the heavy velvet curtains, John stepped into the cool night air, the city's pulse thrumming around him. The streets were alive with the glow of neon signs and the distant hum of traffic, but there was an eerie stillness in the direction the girl had gone. His polished Italian leather shoes clicked sharply against the pavement as he moved, his heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and dread. Why was he doing this? He was a senator, a man who shaped laws and influenced nations, not someone who chased after street children. Yet the image of her small hands clutching that plastic bag played on a loop in his mind, urging him forward. He scanned the street, his eyes catching a glimpse of her faded sweater as she turned into a narrow alley a block away. His pace quickened, the city's glamour fading behind him as he followed her into the shadows. The alley was a forgotten corner of the city, tucked between towering buildings that seemed to turn their backs on it. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of decay and neglect, and the streetlights barely reached this far, casting dim pools of light that flickered like dying stars. John's breath hitched as he spotted her again, kneeling on the ground beside a figure slumped against the wall. His legs froze at the alley's entrance, his mind struggling to process what he saw. The girl was gently shaking a woman, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Mom, wake up. I got food. It's good, I promise." The woman was motionless, her body wrapped in a threadbare blanket, her face pale and gaunt under the faint light. Her lips were cracked, her breathing shallow, and her skin burned with a fever that made John's stomach lurch. The girl, Lynn, he would later learn her name, looked up, her eyes meeting his, and in that moment, John felt the weight of the world shift. This wasn't just a child scavenging for scraps. This was a daughter fighting to keep her mother alive, yards away from a restaurant where people spent fortunes on a single course. His heart pounded, his hands trembling as he reached for his phone. The reality of what he'd stumbled into, too raw, too real to ignore. Support our storytelling. This story is just the beginning of a journey into the power of compassion and human connection. If you're moved by Lynn's courage and John's awakening, please consider supporting our channel. Your donations help us create more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us what truly matters. Every contribution, no matter how small, keeps this platform alive and allows us to share these powerful narratives with the world. Visit our donation page, insert link, to make a difference today. Thank you for being part of our community. The alley was a world apart from the Silver Crescent's polished elegance, a shadowed crevice where the city's pulse faded into a suffocating stillness. The air hung heavy with the stench of damp concrete and rotting garbage, and the flickering light from a broken street lamp cast jagged shadows on the crumbling brick walls. John Neely Kennedy stood at the alley's edge, his tailored suit absurdly out of place, his heart hammering as he watched the small girl Lynn kneel beside her mother. The woman lay slumped on a makeshift bed of cardboard and a tattered blanket, her breathing so faint it barely stirred the night air. Lynn's voice, soft but urgent, cut through the silence. "Mom, please, I got food. It's good, I swear." She gently shook her mother's shoulder, her small hands trembling as she unpacked the plastic bag, the Wagyu steak and roasted vegetables, now a pitiful offering against the gravity of the scene. John's throat tightened, his polished world unraveling at the sight of this child's desperate devotion. The woman's face was ghostly pale. Her lips cracked like parched earth, and her skin radiated a feverish heat that made John's stomach churn. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers clumsy as he dialed 911, his voice cracking as he spoke. "There's a woman in an alley near the Silver Crescent. She's in bad shape. Critical. There's a kid with her. Hurry." The operator's calm questions felt like an insult to the chaos in his mind, but he forced himself to answer, giving the cross streets his eyes, never leaving Lynn and her mother. As he hung up, John took a hesitant step forward, the gravel crunching under his polished shoes. Lynn's head snapped up, her brown eyes locking onto his, not with fear, but with a weary resignation that shook him to his core. She didn't cry or flinch. She just stared as if she'd seen too much of the world's indifference to expect anything different from him. "What's wrong with her?" John asked, his voice rough, barely recognizing it as his own. He crouched beside them, the damp ground seeping through his trousers, but he didn't care. Lynn's gaze didn't waver. "She's sick," she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "She's been sick for a long time. No medicine, no doctor. I try to help, but it's not enough." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of a child forced to bear an adult's burden. John reached out, hesitating before touching the woman's forehead. Her skin was scalding her breath, a shallow rasp that seemed to fade with each passing second. His mind raced the contrast between this alley and the Silver Crescent's opulence, burning like acid. How could this be happening, just blocks from where people spent thousands on a single bottle of wine? "Lynn," he said, testing her name. His voice softer now. "That's your name, right? What happened to her?" Lynn nodded, her fingers clutching the edge of her mother's blanket. "Her name's Mai. She used to be a teacher. She got sick a while ago. Pneumonia," she said. "We couldn't afford the hospital. She told me to keep going to find food, but—" Her voice broke just for a moment before she swallowed hard and continued. "She hasn't eaten much. I thought the food would help." John's chest tightened, the image of the steak he'd so casually pushed toward her, now a mocking symbol of his ignorance. He looked at Mai, her face gaunt, but still holding traces of a quiet strength, and a memory stirred unbidden and sharp. A young teacher years ago in a rundown school in Louisiana. She'd given him books, her voice gentle but firm, telling him he could be more than the poverty that defined his childhood. "You're smart, John," she'd said. "Don't let the world tell you otherwise. Could it be her?" The thought hit him like a freight train, but he pushed it down, not ready to face the possibility. The wail of sirens broke through the alley's stillness, red and blue lights flashing against the walls as an ambulance pulled up. Paramedics rushed forward, their movements efficient but urgent, assessing Mai's condition with practiced hands. Lynn clung to her mother's side, her small body tense as they lifted Mai onto a stretcher. "Don't take her away." Lynn's voice cracked, the first sign of panic John had seen in her. He knelt beside her, his hand hovering before resting lightly on her shoulder. "They're helping her, Lynn. They're taking her to a hospital. She'll be okay." He wasn't sure if he was convincing her or himself, but the words felt like a lifeline. Lynn looked at him, her eyes searching his face for a truth she could trust, and for the first time, John felt the weight of his own promises. The paramedics worked quickly, securing an oxygen mask over Mai's face. Their voices a blur of medical terms: hypothermia, dehydration, severe pneumonia. John stood feeling useless as they loaded Mai into the ambulance. Lynn started to follow, but a paramedic gently stopped her. "She needs you to be strong, kid. We'll take care of her." John made a split-second decision. "I'm going with them," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The paramedic nodded, and John helped Lynn into the ambulance, her small hand gripping his tightly. The doors slammed shut, and the vehicle lurched forward, the city blurring past the windows. Inside, the sterile light cast harsh shadows on Lynn's face, her eyes fixed on her mother's still form. John sat beside her, his mind a storm of questions and guilt. How had Mai ended up here? If she was the teacher he remembered, how had he forgotten her? He'd built a career on promises of progress, of helping the vulnerable. But here was the reality: a woman who'd shaped his life left to die in an alley. The weight of his success, his speeches, his carefully crafted image felt like a Linnea's voice pulled him back. "She used to tell me stories," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "about a boy named John. She said she gave him books, told him he could change the world. She was proud of him." John's breath caught the confirmation slicing through him. It was her. Mai, the teacher who'd seen something in him when he was just a scrawny kid with no future. He'd never thanked her, never looked back after he'd climbed out of poverty. The shame was suffocating. The ambulance pulled into the hospital's emergency bay, and the chaos of the ER swallowed them. Nurses and doctors moved in a flurry, wheeling Mai away as Lynn tried to follow, her small frame shaking. John stayed close, his hand on her shoulder, guiding her to a waiting area. "They're going to help her," he said again, but the words felt hollow. Lynn sat clutching her plastic bag, the food inside now cold and forgotten. John looked at her, at the resilience in her eyes, and felt a resolve harden within him. He couldn't undo the years he'd ignored Mai's existence, but he could act now. He pulled out his phone again, this time calling his assistant. "Get me the best doctor you can find, pulmonary specialist, and clear my schedule. I'm at Riverside Hospital." His assistant's confusion was audible, but John cut her off. "Just do it." He hung up his gaze, returning to Lynn. She was watching him, her expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, hope perhaps, or the ghost of trust. John knew this moment was a turning point. He'd stepped into this alley a senator, a man of power and privilege, but he was leaving it as something else, someone who couldn't walk away. The sterile hum of Riverside Hospital was a stark contrast to the alley's grim desolation, its fluorescent lights casting a cold, clinical glow over the bustling corridors. The air smelled of antiseptic and urgency, punctuated by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the soft shuffle of nurses' footsteps. John Neely Kennedy sat in a stiff plastic chair outside Mai's room, his usually impeccable suit now slightly rumpled, his tie loosened as if it could ease the tightness in his chest. Lynn sat beside him, her small frame curled into the chair, clutching the locket with her mother's photo. A faded image of Mai in better days, smiling, with a warmth that seemed impossible in the face of her current condition. The hospital had become their temporary world, a place where hope and uncertainty collided with every update from the doctors. Mai was stable but frail, her pneumonia complicated by years of neglect and malnutrition. John had ensured she received the best care, pulling strings to secure a top pulmonologist and covering every expense without hesitation. Yet, as he watched Lynn's quiet vigil, her eyes fixed on the door to her mother's room, he knew money alone couldn't heal the deeper wounds, those of a child forced to grow up too fast, and of a woman who had given everything only to be forgotten by the world. John's days had shifted dramatically. His Senate office, once the center of his universe, felt like a distant memory, as he spent hours at the hospital coordinating with social workers, therapists, and a child psychologist to ensure Lynn had support. He'd arranged a small apartment nearby for her, a clean, warm space where she could sleep without fear, and made sure she had meals that didn't come from a plastic bag. But it was the time he spent with Lynn that began to change him. One afternoon, as they sat in the hospital cafeteria, Lynn nibbled on a sandwich, her eyes scanning a worn book of fairy tales she'd found in the waiting room. "Mom used to read these to me," she said, her voice soft but steady. She said, "Stories keep you going, even when things are bad." John nodded, his throat tight. "She's right. Stories remind us there's something worth fighting for." Lynn looked up, her gaze piercing. "Do you have stories, Mr. John?" The question caught him off guard, and for a moment he was back in that Louisiana classroom, Mai's voice encouraging him to dream beyond his circumstances. He realized he'd stopped telling stories long ago, trading them for speeches and sound bites. "I used to," he admitted. "Maybe it's time I start again." That conversation sparked something in John. He began bringing books to the hospital, reading to Lynn during the long hours of waiting. They started with fairy tales, then moved to adventure stories, her eyes lighting up at tales of heroes overcoming impossible odds. Through these moments, John saw Lynn's resilience in a new light, not just a survival instinct, but a quiet strength that reminded him of her mother. He also began meeting with hospital staff and local nonprofits, learning about the gaps in the system that had left Mai and Lynn to fend for themselves. The more he learned, the more he saw the city's underbelly, a network of forgotten people, hidden just beyond the glow of its skyscrapers. He'd spent years crafting policies, but they'd been abstract, detached. Now, with Lynn's hand in his, as they walked the hospital halls, those policies had a face, a name, a story. Yet John wrestled with a nagging question. Was he doing this for Lynn and Mai, or to quiet the guilt that gnawed at him? The memory of Mai's kindness, her belief in him when he was just a boy, haunted him. He'd built an empire of influence, yet he'd never reached out to thank her, never checked if she was okay. That neglect felt like a betrayal, one he couldn't shake, as he watched Lynn draw pictures for her mother. Her small hands sketching houses with gardens, a world she'd never known. One evening, as they sat in Mai's room, Lynn showed him a drawing, a simple scene of a woman and a girl holding hands under a bright sun. "That's us," she said, pointing to the figures. "When Mom gets better." John's heart ached, the innocence of her hope clashing with the reality of Mai's fragile condition. He wanted to promise her that everything would be okay, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he said, "You're strong, Lynn. Stronger than I ever was at your age." She looked at him, her eyes searching, and for a moment he felt she saw through him, through the senator, the power, the polished exterior to the boy he'd once been. John's transformation wasn't just personal. It began to ripple outward. He started asking harder questions, not just of himself, but of the system he'd long navigated. Why were there no safety nets for people like Mai? Why did a child have to beg for leftovers to keep her mother alive? He met with a local nonprofit director, a woman named Clara, who'd spent decades advocating for the homeless. Over coffee in a cramped hospital break room, she laid out the stark reality. Thousands of families slipped through the cracks every year, their stories buried under bureaucracy and indifference. "You can't fix it all," Clara said, her voice firm but kind. "But you can start somewhere." John nodded, his mind racing. He'd always seen his role as a senator as one of grand gestures, bills passed, speeches delivered, but now he saw the power of small, deliberate actions. He began drafting ideas for a local initiative, a fund to provide emergency aid for families like Lynn's, named after Mai, to honor her quiet impact. As weeks passed, Mai showed signs of recovery, though the road was long. Her fever broke, and she began to sit up, her eyes regaining a spark of the teacher John remembered. Lynn, too, was changing. With proper meals and a safe place to sleep, her cheeks filled out, and her laughter, though rare, began to echo in the hospital room. One day, as John helped her with a math worksheet, a task that reminded him painfully of Mai's lessons, he noticed her smile, fleeting but real. "You're good at this," he said, pointing to her neatly solved equations. Lynn shrugged, but her eyes shone. "Mom says math is like a story. You just have to find the answer." John chuckled, the sound foreign to him after weeks of tension. In that moment, he realized he wasn't just helping Lynn, he was learning from her unyielding hope, despite a world that had offered her so little. The turning point came one quiet evening when Mai was well enough to speak. John sat by her bedside, Lynn asleep in the chair beside him, her head resting on his arm. Mai's voice was weak but clear. "You don't have to do this, John," she said, her eyes meeting his. "You don't owe me anything." He shook his head, his voice thick. "I owe you everything. You believed in me when no one else did. I forgot that. And I'm sorry." Mai smiled, a faint echo of the teacher he'd known. "You're here now. That's enough." Her words broke something open in him, a dam of guilt and resolve. He wasn't just saving Mai and Lynn, he was saving himself, rediscovering the boy who'd once believed in dreams bigger than his circumstances. John left the hospital that night with a new purpose. He began working on the Mai Fund, a non-profit to support families on the brink, ensuring no child would have to beg for leftovers again. It wasn't a grand Senate bill, but it was real, tangible, a step toward the change he'd long preached, but never fully understood. As he walked through the city, the skyscrapers looming above, he saw them differently, not as monuments to success, but as walls that hid stories like Lynn's. He vowed to tear down those walls, one act of compassion at a time.